Boris Johnson has told the Privileges Committee, despite their massive trawl of WhatsApps and emails relating to the parties during lockdown in Downing Street, they failed to find a smoking gun. Hard evidence that he knew about parties and covered them up. Boris Johnson says the committee's case against him relies heavily on the assertions of his former chief aide, Dominic Cummings, who, he tells the committee, bears an animus towards me. He cannot be treated as a credible witness. Boris Johnson's central defence is that what he saw when he dropped in on gatherings looked restrained and within the COVID guidance. His view of what they descended into later, or of parties he wasn't at, was dependent on official advice. On the 18th of December 2020, during lockdown, a boozy Christmas party gathering in Downing Street ended after midnight. Wine down a wall, a panic alarm accidentally triggered. 4 days later, Downing Street staff were laughing about it in a practice press conference.
His fictional party was a business meeting. And it was not socially distanced.
When that tape was leaked, Boris Johnson says he sought assurances from staff. His Director of Communications, Jack Doyle, who'd been at the party, wrote, "I think you can say I've been assured there was no party and no rules were broken." Boris Johnson says his denials of lockdown rule-breaking in Parliament rested on assurances like that one.
There was no party and that no COVID rules were broken, and that is what I have been repeatedly assured.
A few days later, Boris Johnson WhatsApps Jack Doyle referring to the gathering with the P word. Is there a way we could get the truth about this party out there? Boris Johnson says he didn't think it was a party, but used the word as shorthand. It was a word the media were using that he'd picked up. 2 weeks after this gathering, Boris Johnson was raising a glass again in the same Downing Street room at leaving drinks for an official. One present remembers him saying, "This is probably the most unsocially distanced gathering in the UK right now." Boris Johnson writes to the committee, "I don't remember the words. It seems unlikely. I might well have made observations in speeches about social distancing and whether it was being perfectly observed. That doesn't mean that I thought guidance was contravened." Boris Johnson's submission says there was no shortage of people who wished him ill in Downing Street and would have leaked it if they thought he was misleading Parliament. His allies see enemies everywhere.
If I were the sitting Prime Minister, the person that's the biggest thorn in my side is the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. So it's not as though he has many friends when it comes to the current operation in Number 10, and also, many of his colleagues who, for all I know, have had a history of dealing with him in the past.
For Boris Johnson, the stakes are high. The Privileges Committee could decide to dole out a punishment at the severe end, and if a majority of MPs then back it, he could face a by-election in his own constituency. His defence comes under scrutiny at the Privileges Committee meeting tomorrow. They've set aside up to 4 hours for the interrogation. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News, Westminster.
Well, the Brexiteer group of Conservative MPs, the European Research Group, has criticised the key element of Rishi Sunak's Brexit deal for Northern Ireland, but stopped short of saying they won't support it in the Commons. The ERG commissioned a report by legal experts to scrutinise Mr Sunak's Windsor framework. The ERG's chair said its veto for Northern Irish politicians over new EU regulations would be practically useless.
That EU law will still be supreme in Northern Ireland. The rights of its people under the 1800 Act of Union are not restored. The Green Lane is not really a green lane at all. The Stormont break is practically useless, and the framework itself has no exit other than through a highly complex legal process.
Well, I'm joined now by the Conservative MP Peter Bone, who is a supporter of Boris Johnson. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, on Northern Ireland, will you be backing Rishi Sunak's Windsor framework, or are you with Mark Francois and what's left of the ERG?
Well, your question poses the answer. We're not discussing the Windsor framework tomorrow. We were promised a full debate on the whole Windsor framework, which there'd be a vote on. We're not getting that. What we're getting is a 3-hour debate on a statutory instrument to do with the Stormont break. And it's a complete, that's disrespecting
So will you oppose it?
Well, I will listen to all the arguments to do with the break, but from what I've heard so far, and you've just played a clip from what Mark Francois said, I'm looking at the document the ERG have produced, and it does seem to be a pretty useless break. So I'm not sure I will be voting for it.
So this is not the great political triumph Rishi Sunak thought it was?
Well, if you ever thought it was, I think that isn't. Look, what the government has done, in my opinion, is oversold the Windsor framework. It's an improvement on the current situation, but it doesn't solve all the problems by far. And the break is really never ever going to be used because it's so complicated.
OK. Let's get to Boris Johnson. The Privileges Committee has a Conservative majority. Do you trust it to come to the right conclusion about Boris Johnson?
Well, I think the Privileges Committee can only come to one decision based on the evidence, and that Boris Johnson did not knowingly mislead Parliament. Now, I have a question I have to say about the chairman of that committee. She was a former interim leader of the Labour Party twice and has already ruled against Boris.
But do you trust the committee, which has a Conservative majority?
Well, I trust any committee of the House of Commons, but it won't be the committee that makes the decision in the end. It will be the Commons and
well, exactly. That's the point of my question. I mean, so are you saying you might just disagree with whatever they find? If they find against Boris Johnson, you and other Conservatives might just disagree and vote the sanction down?
And maybe other members of Parliament, not just Conservatives. Let's wait and see what they decide.
But that's just possible, is it?
But it's possible, but based on the evidence, it seems to me the only conclusion they can come to is that Boris did not knowingly mislead the Commons, and if he did not, if he didn't knowingly mislead the Commons, then he's not guilty of anything.
I mean, it's our view, certainly.
It's not a view. I think it's completely clear.
Well,
look at the evidence.
A lot of people think it's completely clear the other way, that it was blindingly obvious to Boris Johnson what the rules were, and that this is sort of a formality. But let's see what your colleagues say. The point is, if you vote against the Privileges Committee findings and you spare Boris Johnson and you keep him in place and he doesn't face any kind of sanction, what credibility would the House of Commons have in policing itself?
Well, I think the only conclusion that the House of Commons Privileges Committee can come to is that Boris did not knowingly mislead the Commons, and that's the only issue that matters. Now, you're saying there's tons of people that disbelieve that, but there is no evidence of that whatsoever. I mean, all of thousands and thousands and thousands of WhatsApp messages, there are none that told Boris that there had been parties.
Why did Allegra Stratton have to resign?
Well, that was to do with when she was doing a mock interview.
No, it was over the revelation of the party, wasn't it?
No, but that was nothing to do with Boris. I mean, Boris has been consistent, and I believe him. And I'm sure the Privileges Committee, when they look at all the evidence, will come to the same conclusion, that he did not deliberately mislead Parliament.
Let's see. Peter Bone, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.